You'd think getting back to the moon would be easier these days,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, we're talking self-driving cars, AI, the works. We did it back in the 70s, so why all the hype about it being so hard this time around?
It's a fair question, and to be honest, it's a lot more nuanced than just saying, hey, we did it before, we can do it again. This deep dive, we're going to really dig into why that is.
We've got a fascinating Scientific American article that lays it all out, plus some pretty wild visuals comparing Artemis to, well, those Apollo missions everyone loves to bring up.
Exactly, those iconic missions. But it's crucial to remember those were over 50 years ago. The world's a tad different now, and so is the whole space exploration game.
So true. We're not just aiming for a repeat here. This isn't about reliving past glory.
This is about Artemis, and trust me, the goals, way more ambitious. We're talking about a sustainable lunar base,
Wow.
lunar base, folks, and using that as a stepping stone to Mars.
Mars. I mean, it's mind-blowing. But before we get ahead of ourselves, dreaming of moon bases and Martian colonies, there's a bit of a, shall we say, reality check we need to address.
Ah, yes, you're talking about the elephant in the room delays and those ever-increasing costs.
A bit of a downer, honestly.
It's true. By 2025, Artemis is projected to have racked up a bill of about, get this, $93 billion.
Wow. 93 billion, that's billions, like with a B, more than they initially planned.
Unfortunately, yes. And the thing is, it's not just about the money either. Remember those hiccups during Artemis 4 with the Orion capsule's heat shield?
Yeah, didn't it not degrade the way engineers expected?
Exactly. They're still trying to figure out why it behaves so differently. And that's a pretty big deal when you're talking about bringing astronauts back home safely. At those speeds, any unexpected behavior, that's a major concern.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, weren't there some issues with the power systems on Artemis 3?
Yeah, some anomalies popped up, and those, let me tell you, those could spell disaster for any crewed missions going forward. We're talking life support, propulsion, everything relies on those power systems. It's a little unnerving when you put it like that. Makes you wonder why it seems so much harder to do something we managed over half a century ago, Like, haven't we learned anything?
You'd think, right, with all the advancements we've made. I mean, we're carrying around smartphones more powerful than the computers used during Apollo. But that's where things get interesting. This Scientific American article really dives into that, how different the world is today compared to the Apollo era.
The landscape of space exploration, total different. One of the biggest challenges, and this might come as a surprise, is that we've lost a lot of the expertise we had back then.
Lost it. You mean like those old instruction manuals you find in your attic?
Kind of, but on a much larger scale. Imagine trying to, I don't know, run a marathon today when the last time you even jogged was 50 years ago.
Oof, yeah, good luck with that.
Exactly. We haven't been to the moon in over 50 years. While we've retained some knowledge from the Apollo missions, that hands-on experience, that know-how, it's faded.
So it's like we have the recipe for Grandma's famous cookies, but half the instructions are missing.
Exactly. We might have the basic idea, but those crucial details, the nuances that make all the difference, they're gone.
And that loss of expertise, that's where all sorts of unforeseen technological challenges rear their ugly heads.
Right, like trying to jam a supercharged engine into a vintage car. You can try, but chances are you're going to have to rebuild the whole car just to handle it.
Makes you appreciate the engineering genius behind the Saturn V rocket they used for Apollo, doesn't it?
No kidding. And get this, Boeing, the company that built the Saturn V, they're also involved in building the core stage for the new SLS rocket for Artemis.
Talk about a blast from the past.
Right. But here's the thing. While the fundamentals of rocket science haven't drastically changed, everything else has. The materials, the manufacturing, the safety standards, they've all evolved. And Boeing, they have to adapt those old designs to these new requirements.
So they're basically teaching an old dog new tricks.
Pretty much. And Boeing's responsibilities go beyond just the physical rocket, too. They also developed the avionics system.
The avionics system, so the brains of the rocket.
Precisely. And while modern-day avionics are light years ahead of what we had during Apollo, it's worth noting that Boeing has faced some, let's say, criticism recently.
Criticism?
Yeah, regarding quality control issues. And not just in their airplanes. We're talking spacecraft malfunctions, too. There was even that incident where 2 astronauts were stranded on the International Space Station because of a malfunctioning spacecraft.
Yikes. That's a stark reminder that even with all our fancy technology and decades of experience, space travel is still, well, risky business.
No doubt about it. Space is unforgiving and unpredictable. But speaking of risky business, we can't forget about the Orion spacecraft itself. That's Lockheed Martin's baby. And let me tell you, this ain't your grandpa's Apollo capsule.
So less of a capsule, more like a mini space station.
Spot on. It's built for these long-haul journeys, lunar voyages that last weeks, not days, with advanced life support systems and everything.
This Scientific American article really gets into how seriously Lockheed Martin took the design and testing for Orion. They went all out with simulations and inspections to make sure it could handle whatever space threw at it.
Oh, they were meticulous, analyzing every single stress factor, from launch and re-entry to, get this, even potential micrometeoroid strikes. They really were sweating the small stuff.
It's clear that safety is a much higher priority now than it was during Apollo. But even with all that meticulous planning and fancy simulations, didn't we still run into those unexpected issues with Orion during Artemis the latest? Like, wasn't that heat shield thing a bit of a curveball?
Yeah, it really highlights how even when you think you've thought of everything, space always finds a way to surprise you. Those unexpected hiccups, they're all part of the learning process.
Makes you realize we're a long way from having it all figured out.
Exactly. We're constantly learning, adapting, refining our approaches. And that's crucial, especially if we're serious about this whole sustainable presence on the moon thing.
It's not just about planting a flag and calling it a day anymore. It's about playing the long game.
Precisely. But, and this is a big but, while we're busy pushing those boundaries, we also got to keep those financial and political realities in check.
It always seems to come back to those two, doesn't it?
It does, unfortunately. We've talked about the technical hurdles, but the budget for Artemis. Let's just say it's a challenge in itself.
I mean, we already heard about the billions over budget, so yeah, I can only imagine.
NASA's current budget is a drop in the bucket compared to what they had during Apollo. And those financial constraints, they have a domino effect. Delays, compromises, tough decisions about priorities, it all adds up.
It's like you can have the best chefs in the world working on a gourmet meal. But if you give them a shoestring budget, something's got to give.
That's a great analogy. And then you throw in the political landscape. Back in the 60s, the space race was the name of the game. National priority, fueled by Cold War tensions. Today, it's more of a global affair.
So, more chefs in the kitchen, so to speak.
Exactly. And while that's amazing for international cooperation, it does add a layer of, shall we say, complexity.
More cooks in the kitchen, more chances for things to go sideways.
That's one way to put it. But on a serious note, it means navigating different priorities, different decision-making processes, which inevitably, yes, can slow things down.
Makes sense. You've got different countries, different space agencies, all with their own agendas and ways of doing things.
And their own budgets, which definitely impacts what they can and can't contribute. It's definitely a balancing act. But hey, that's the name of the game when you're talking about a global endeavor, right?
You know, for all the talk about international collaboration and budgetary constraints, we haven't really dived into the heart of the matter, the technology.
Right. Let's get into the nitty-gritty.
This Scientific American article really goes deep on the Space Launch System, the SLS, as they call it.
It's a beast of a rocket.
The most powerful one ever built, actually, designed to carry astronauts and all their cargo way beyond Earth's orbit. But building this thing, well, it hasn't exactly been a smooth ride.
It's kind of like, you know, those car shows where they take a vintage car and try to soup it up for a modern-day race?
Yeah, I love those shows.
Total rebuild, right. That's what's going on here. You're dealing with outdated parts, incompatible technology, and the constant headache of things breaking down or not quite working as they should.
I can only imagine. This article mentioned the SLS core stage is absolutely massive.
Huge, over 200 feet tall and almost 30 feet wide. Building something that gigantic while making sure it meets today's safety standards, it's a whole other ballgame.
Makes you appreciate the engineering marvel that was the Saturn V rocket, you know?
Yeah.
The one they used for the Apollo missions.
Yeah, for sure.
And isn't Boeing, the company that built the Saturn V, also involved with building the SLS core stage?
You bet they are. Same company, decades later. Talk about history repeating itself. But here's the catch. The basic principles of rocket science, they haven't changed all that much since the Apollo days. But the materials we use, the way we manufacture things, the safety protocols, those have all evolved. Big time.
So Boeing has this unique challenge. They're taking these old designs and old ways of doing things and trying to make them fit these new, stricter requirements.
It's a tall order, that's for sure, like teaching an old dog new tricks. Possible, but it takes time, patience, and probably a lot of head scratching.
And it's not just the physical rocket they're responsible for either, right?
And
They also developed the avionics system for the
like
SLS.
you got it, the avionics, that's like the brain of the whole operation.
Driving it through space,
Well,
making sure everything runs smoothly.
exactly. And these days, avionics systems, they're light years ahead of what they had during Apollo. But, and this is something to think about, Boeing has been under the microscope lately.
Under the microscope. How so?
Well, there have been some concerns raised about their quality control. And not just for their airplanes, we're talking spacecraft too. Remember that incident where a spacecraft malfunctioned, leaving 2 astronauts stranded on the International Space Station?
Yeah, that was a nail-biter.
Exactly. And Boeing was involved in that. So it's a reminder that even with decades of experience and the most advanced technology, things can still go wrong. Space exploration is inherently risky, no matter how you slice it.
It's a humbling thought for sure.
It is. And speaking of humbling, let's talk about the Orion spacecraft itself. Lockheed Martin built this thing, and it's a far cry from the Apollo capsules.
More like a mini space station, right? We touched on that earlier.
Exactly, it has to be. These missions, they're not quick trips. We're talking weeks-long lunar voyages, and Orion needs to keep those astronauts alive and well for the entire duration.
This Scientific American article goes into detail about how Lockheed Martin took a super serious, super cautious approach to designing and testing Orion. Like, they really went above and beyond with simulations and inspections to find any potential weak points.
They were incredibly thorough because when you're talking about sending humans into the vast unknown, you can't mess around.
They even simulated micrometeoroid strikes, which sounds terrifying, but it's a real danger in space. Talk about attention to detail.
No detail is too small when it comes to human lives. It's clear that safety is paramount now, far more so than during the Apollo era.
Which makes sense. But even with all that meticulous planning and cutting-edge technology, we still had those unexpected hiccups during Artemis I. Remember the heat shield issue?
Oh yeah, the heat shield. It just goes to show that space is full of surprises no matter how much we plan or how advanced our technology gets.
So it's like a constant reminder that we're still learning, still figuring things out as we go.
Absolutely. Every mission, every delay, every unexpected problem, it's a learning opportunity. We adapt, we innovate, and hopefully we don't make the same mistake twice.
Makes you appreciate the whole process a bit more, doesn't it? The challenges, the setbacks, the constant need to push the boundaries of what we know and what we're capable of.
It's all part of the journey. And this journey, it's not just about getting back to the moon. It's about pushing those boundaries, expanding our understanding of the universe, and maybe, just maybe, paving the way for a future where humanity has a permanent address beyond Earth.
It's a pretty inspiring thought when you put it like that. But let's be real here for a second. As awe-inspiring as this all sounds, we can't ignore the financial and political realities that tend to ground us, so to speak.
True, those are always factors. We've talked about the technical challenges, but the budget for Artemis is a whole other beast.
Yeah, and we already touched on how many billions over budget it already is. So it's clearly a major hurdle.
It's a big one. NASA's budget today is a fraction of what it was during Apollo. And when you're working with limited resources, it impacts everything. Timelines get stretched, compromises have to be made, and tough choices about priorities are inevitable.
It's like trying to build your dream home but having to stick to a shoestring budget. You make compromises, right?
Exactly. You have to prioritize.
And then on top of that, you throw in the political landscape. Back in the 60s, space exploration was a national obsession. It was the space race, fueled by the Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union. But today, it's a different world.
It's a global effort now.
With more players at the table, so to speak.
Exactly. And that's a good thing, mostly. International collaboration is key for something as ambitious and complex as Artemis. But, and this is a big but, it also adds a layer of, well, let's just say it can complicate things.
More cooks in the kitchen, as they say.
That's one way to put it. You've got different countries, different space agencies, all with their own priorities, their own ways of doing things, and let's be honest, their own budgets.
So it's not as simple as just saying we're going back to the moon and blasting off, is it?
Not anymore. It's a delicate dance of diplomacy, collaboration, and compromise.
We've talked about the technical stuff, the money, the politics. It's easy to get lost in the weeds of why Artemis is such a massive undertaking. But before we wrap up, I want to step back for a second. Look at the bigger picture.
The big why.
Exactly. Why does this all matter? Why should anyone listening care about us going back to the moon?
It's a good question. And I think the most fascinating thing about Artemis is that it represents a totally different way of thinking about space exploration. We're not in the Cold War era anymore, racing to beat another country to the finish line.
It's not just about planting a flag and saying, we were here first.
Not at all. This is about collaboration, about sustainability, about a global effort to explore space responsibly. We're not just visitors this time.
We're talking about a future where humanity could actually live and work on the moon long term.
That's the goal. But that brings up a really interesting point. Artemis, with its focus on safety and collaboration, it's definitely a slower, more expensive approach.
And we've seen how those delays and costs have played out. So are we sacrificing speed and efficiency in the pursuit of these loftier goals? Is that the trade-off?
It's a valid question, and it's tempting to look back at the Apollo missions and think, why can't we do it like that again? Faster, bolder. But here's the thing.
When listening.
That go-for-it attitude, it might have worked back then, but this is a different game. This measured approach, it might seem slow now, but it could be way more beneficial in the long run.
Interesting. How so?
Think about it. By involving multiple countries, by being more cautious, more deliberate about sustainability and risk, we're basically building a global community of spacefaring nations. And that has the potential to create a much more equitable, more cooperative future for space exploration. One that benefits everyone, not just the select few.
So instead of a race to the finish line, it's more like building a house. You take the time to lay a strong foundation, even if it takes longer, because that's what makes it last.
Exactly. A strong foundation for a future in space. And this slower pace, it also allows for more scientific discovery, more technological innovation. Every mission, every delay, every obstacle, it's a chance to learn, to adapt, to push those boundaries of human knowledge even further.
It's a good reminder that space exploration isn't a straight line. It's messy, it's unpredictable, there are going to be detours along the way.
There will be. But those detours often lead to the most interesting discoveries. And along the way, we're not just increasing our chances of reaching the moon and Mars, we're developing technologies that can benefit life right here on Earth.
That's something we haven't really touched on yet.
It's huge. Think about all the advancements that have come from space exploration materials, science, computing, robotics, life support systems. The list goes on and on.
And those advancements, they have real-world applications in so many fields. Medicine, energy, environmental protection.
It's all connected. So yeah, Artemis might seem like it's laser focused on the moon, but its impact, it ripples out way beyond that. It's influencing countless aspects of our lives right here on Earth.
Which brings us back to that initial question. If we're so technologically advanced, why does going back to the moon seem even harder than it was 50 years ago?
It's because it's not just about replicating what we did back then. It's about doing it better, safer, more sustainably, and in a way that benefits all of humanity. That's a much taller order.
It's a whole new way of thinking about our place in space. Not just as explorers, but as citizens of the cosmos.
Well said. And that shift in perspective, that's what makes Artemis so significant. It's not just about the destination, it's about the journey and what we learn along the way.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive into the challenges of returning to the moon. It's been quite a journey, and I think we've all learned a lot.
We've only just scratched the surface.
True. But hopefully this conversation has sparked some curiosity, maybe even inspired some of you listening to learn more about the Artemis program and what it means for the future of humanity in space. Until next time, keep looking up.